Hello and welcome back to our study of First Peter, our thematic study. This is video number 19 of what will be a total of 20 presentations. I hope that this study has been a tremendous benefit to you. I mentioned to you at the very beginning, this to me is an exciting study when we can correlate First Peter with the entire corpus of biblical eschatology. And we can see how urgently Peter is writing about the imminent consummation. Now, our final presentation, number 20, will be a focus on the imminence of the end, on the imminence of the resurrection, on the imminence of the parousia, on the imminence of the judgment. And we will demonstrate that there's simply no way to negate, no way to mitigate, no way to deny that Peter was absolutely affirming, not simply hoping, but he was affirming that the day of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection was about to take place. Well, in this particular study, what I want to do is to focus on the direct parallels between 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and 1 Peter. This will be kind of a companion study to one of our earlier videos in which we talked about the glory to be revealed, drawing on Romans chapter 8, where Paul talked about the fact that they were, at that time, when he wrote Romans, approximately 57 AD, experiencing the, quote, sufferings of Christ, and they were expecting the glory about to be revealed. Likewise, Peter talks about the fact that they were enduring the sufferings of Christ and were expecting the glory about to be revealed. Go back and look at that, refresh your memory about how critical of a study this is. Because what this has to do with is the claim that Paul was anticipating the future to him restoration of physical creation. Well, if that's true, then obviously the passing of 2,000 years has falsified that imminent expectation. The fact is, Paul was not, nor was Peter, expecting the recreation of material creation to some Edenic perfection. That will be brought home even further in this particular lesson, as I want to adduce for you several direct parallels between 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and 1 Peter. By bringing forth these parallels, it will be apparent, number one, that Paul and Peter were saying exactly the same thing. Paul was talking about resurrection. Peter is talking about resurrection. And on it goes. And this will just simply drive home, number one, the unity of Scripture. Number two, the fact that Peter's eschatology, Paul's eschatology, was nothing but the hope of Israel found in the Old Covenant prophets. Okay, let's begin then with an examination of the parallels between 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Peter. The point number one that I want to drive home that I just mentioned, that I have mentioned in virtually every one of these videos, is that Paul's expectation of the resurrection, Peter's expectation of the reception of the incorruptible, undefilable inheritance was based upon God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in his anticipation of the resurrection, said, when the mortal has put on immortality, when the corruptible has put on incorruptibility, then will be brought to pass the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? He quotes directly, verbatim, from Isaiah 25 and Hosea chapter 13. Now I want you to hang on to the fact pardon me, that Paul's expectation of the resurrection is taken directly from Hosea. You want to hang on to that, all right? Peter's expectation of the inheritance is from the Old Testament. He talks about the eternal inheritance that they were expecting, to which they had been begotten again through the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he says they were at that time receiving the salvation of their souls, which was the goal of their faith, and it was that salvation that the Old Covenant prophets foretold. So we have Paul speaking of the coming of the eternal, incorruptible, immortal inheritance foretold by Isaiah and Hosea, and we have Peter speaking of the coming of the inheritance that was incorruptible, undefilable, that would not fade away, and it was promised by the Old Covenant prophets. Folks, it's simply undeniable that Paul and Peter were both predicting and anticipating the same identical thing. Now, you just absolutely have to catch the power of this next point. Paul, when speaking of the, quote, redemption of the body, the adoption, i.e. the redemption of the body, in Romans 8 and 23, he said that adoption, i.e. the redemption of the body, was a promise that belonged to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh. Romans 9, 1-3. Do you catch this? The promises of the resurrection, found in Isaiah, found in Hosea, found in Daniel 9, found in Daniel 12, found in Ezekiel 37, found in Isaiah 26, found in Isaiah 27. Do you get the idea? All of those Old Covenant promises were promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh. Now, this is incredibly important. And you may be watching now and you say, you know, Preston, you have emphasized the point that God's promises of the resurrection were promises made to Old Covenant Israel. You've said it over and over again. Well, that's right. But let me drive home the point of why this is important. It is important because in public debates and in private debates with postmillennialists and amillennialists, I have asked them, are your eschatological hopes based upon, taken from God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? They have almost invariably said, no. Oh, wait a minute. Paul's eschatological hope, Peter's eschatological hope was in fact nothing. Nothing but the hope of Israel, Israel after the flesh, found in the Old Testament. Now here's what this means. Folks, this is incredibly important. Since the promise of the resurrection belonged to Israel after the flesh, it demands that the promises of the resurrection would be fulfilled to Israel after the flesh, and while Israel after the flesh as a covenant people still existed. Now I'm about to say something that I know will be misconstrued. It will be taken out of context. It will be blown up and it will be called anti-Semitic. But it is not that at all. You know, anti-Semitic means you hate someone. That's the modern context of the term. That is not at all what I am saying. What I'm about to say is based squarely upon everything that we have seen in this presentation of all of these lessons on 1 Peter. And that is that God loved Israel, God was faithful to Israel, God kept His promises to Israel, but as we saw in the lesson on 1 Peter and 2 Peter 3 and the promise of the new creation, it was always and ever God's original intent that the Old Covenant nation would cease to exist as a covenant people because God was going to create an all-inclusive covenant people under Messiah and the new covenant. Folks, that was God's plan from the very beginning. He used the limited, exclusive, ethnic people to bring salvation to the nations. That's Isaiah 49, 6 and following. Okay, if it is the case that God's Old Covenant promises of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, the eternal, immortal, incorruptible inheritance of 1 Peter chapter 1, 3 and following, was a promise made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people. And if it is the case that Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people does not exist today, then it must be the case, number one, that either God's promises to Israel after the flesh as a covenant people failed, but Paul said it was impossible for God's promises to Israel to fail, Romans 11, 28 and following, or it means that God's promises to Israel after the flesh as a covenant people were fulfilled by the time of the cessation of Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people. Well, guess what, folks? Israel, after the flesh, as a covenant people, ceased to exist in AD 70. Now, I don't have time to go into a full documentation of that, but let me share with you something. In my book, Israel, 1948, Countdown to Nowhere, I document from Jewish sources. Do you catch the power of that? I document from Jewish sources where they admit there is no such thing today as a homogeneous group of people descended from Abraham by blood. That's right. The Jewish Encyclopedia itself says there is no nation of Israel, there is no ethnic group of people called Israel today that is descended from Abraham by blood. Folks, this is a fatal admission. Because God's Old Covenant promises of the resurrection were made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people. Okay, that's really all the time that I have for that particular point. But look, this point alone completely devastates any futurist view of resurrection. Any of them. The dispensationalists cannot claim that God's promises to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people are still valid, because even the nation of Israel today admits there is no such thing as a nation of Israel descended from Abraham. Case closed. Amillennialists and postmillennialists cannot appeal to the predictions of the resurrection as yet future without demanding the current existence of Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people. They don't believe they exist. Well, if Israel after the flesh as a covenant people does not exist, then let me reiterate, God's promises to Israel after the flesh as a covenant people either failed, not possible, or he kept his promises to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as an Old Covenant people, but Israel after the flesh as a covenant people ceased to exist in AD 70. Case closed. Game, set, and match. There is no way out of this dilemma for any of the futurist eschatologies. Okay, well, here I am. I've spent almost 15 minutes on that very first point. So let me hurriedly go on now to notice the comparison once again between Paul. Now notice in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul cites Hosea chapter 13, verse 14 directly. When the mortal has put on immortality, the corruptible has put on incorruption, then shall be brought to pass. Where is the victory of the grave? Now, here's what you have to realize. I document this in my books. You'll have to study this out for yourself. It's in my book on Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, Fulfilled or Future. I urge you to get that and to read this. But ever so quickly, in Hosea, we have the divorce of Israel because of her spiritual adultery. God said, write her a bill of divorcement. I am not her husband. She is not my wife. Number 2, when God divorced her, he departed from her. Hosea chapter 5, verse 14 and following. I will depart. I will return to my place. Look, Yahweh had never been there personally, private, visibly, physically. But he said, when he divorced Israel, I will depart and return to my place until they repent and turn back to me. See, Israel had departed from her. And when God divorced Israel, watch this carefully, he put her to death. I will tear her as a young lion tears its victim, and no man can heal. Hosea chapter 6, verse 5, he has slain us. In Hosea chapter 13, the passage from which Paul draws, the Lord said of Israel, when Israel humbled himself, he was exalted. But when Ephraim sinned, he died. Yet he sinned more and more. Folks, this is living people, biologically living people, but they were dead. Dead how? Alienated from God. Pardon me. That is the death from which Hosea 13:14 promised resurrection. Now watch this. We have in Hosea the divorce, the departure, and the death. The death is not biological death. It is resurrection out of alienation, out of spiritual death. Oh, but watch what God promised to do. God promised to remarry Israel. Hosea chapter 2, verse 19, actually verse 18, I will make a new covenant with the beast of the field for her. Verse 19, I will betroth her to me again in righteousness. I will betroth her to me again forever. So in the time of the new covenant, God said he would remarry Israel. Point number 2, he said at the time of the remarriage of Israel, he would return. Again, Hosea chapter 5, I will depart until they repent, then I will return to them. Point number 3, he has slain us, but let us return to the Lord, and he will raise us up, well, out of death. Out of what? Out of death. The death of Hosea 13. He will raise us up, and we will live in his sight, in his presence. Now, keep in mind, that's the resurrection promise of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. What does that have to do with 1 Peter? Well, it has everything in the world to do with 1 Peter, because in 1 Peter, we have Peter quoting directly and verbatim from Hosea chapter 1, the promise of the remarriage, which is the resurrection and the return. Where it was said of them, they are not my people, there it shall be said, they are the children of the living God. Hosea chapter 2, I will betroth them again to me forever. So here is Peter drawing on the by the way, Hosea chapter 3, verse 5, Israel would be without priest, without ephod, without altar, until the last days in which they would return to the Lord and serve David their king. Guess what? Peter, pardon me, Peter is drawing directly from Hosea, as we have seen in earlier lessons, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. So Paul appeals directly to Hosea and the prediction of the resurrection, which is not a prediction of the resurrection of biological resurrection of corpses out of the dirt. That's the source of Paul's resurrection doctrine. Here is Peter in 1 Peter quoting and drawing directly from the identical context that Paul did. Now, if Paul is citing Hosea's prophecy of the resurrection, and Hosea's prophecy of the resurrection to incorruptibility, immortality, was not a resurrection from biological death, and if Peter, in his promise of the eternal incorruptible inheritance, and he draws from the identical verses that Paul does, then what does that tell us about the eternal inheritance in 1 Peter? They're both talking about the same identical thing. Same inheritance, same prophetic source. This is astoundingly powerful. And you know what's interesting to me is I find very, very few commentators drawing the comparison between, obviously they quote or they take note that Paul quotes Hosea in 1 Corinthians 15. They might even take note of the fact that Peter draws from Hosea. Okay, they do all of that. But they do not focus on the nature of the death of Hosea. They do not take notice of the fact that remarriage would take place when the new covenant would be made, Hosea 2:18, but that remarriage is the resurrection. They ignore all of this. And yet it lies at the very foundation. It is the source of Paul's resurrection doctrine. It is the source of Peter's resurrection doctrine. I hope you can see this. Pardon me, goodness gracious. Now, notice that Paul posits his resurrection doctrine at the time of the coming of the Lord. In 1 Corinthians 15, 19 through 25, those who are Christ would be raised at his coming, his parousia. Well, in 1 Peter chapter 1, or 1 Peter, Peter talks about the parousia. And he talks about, just like Paul does, the coming of that incorruptible, undefilable inheritance at the time of the parousia of Christ. Just like Peter says, they were to receive that immortal, incorruptible inheritance at the revelation of Jesus Christ, and he was ready to be revealed. So here we have Paul, resurrection at the parousia. We have Peter, inheritance, incorruptible inheritance at the parousia. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that they're talking about the same inheritance at the same time based upon the same promises that God made. Now obviously, and I don't know of anyone that would deny this, Paul's talking about resurrection. I don't know anyone that would deny that Peter, in his discussion of the inheritance, which is incorruptible, undefilable, that cannot fade away, no one denies. That's talking about the resurrection. Well, let me go back to the point. If Paul is talking about the resurrection, and if Peter is talking about the resurrection, and they are both drawing from, pardon me, God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people. And let's not forget, Peter, in 1 Peter, is writing to the 10 northern tribes of the diaspora. He is not writing to the church divorced from Israel. He is not writing to the church that has replaced Israel and taken her promises away from her. No. Peter is writing to the diaspora of Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, just like James was writing to the 12 tribes. It is a tragedy and a travesty when commentators go to 1 Peter and they go to James and they say, well, okay, I know that Peter and James uses the terminology of Israel, but they're actually talking to the church, who is the new Israel, that has replaced Old Covenant Israel because God was through with Israel at the cross. No, as I pointed out in the previous video, when Peter in 1 Peter over and over and over again says, writing to the diaspora, that what was happening in them was the fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to the 10 tribes of Israel. That is prophecy made, prophecy fulfilled, and those old covenant promises, those old covenant prophecies of the restoration of Israel, i.e. the 10 northern tribes, were not promises made to the church. This is incredibly important. Folks, Peter had no concept of a replacement theology. Peter had a theology that said that unless and until God was faithful to Old Covenant Israel, Israel after the flesh, as a covenant people, and reunited both houses of Israel, Ezekiel 37, brought them back together under their Messiah, under the new covenant, until then, salvation in its fullest form could not and would not go to the nations. Now somebody will say, wait a minute, Preston, God was calling the Gentiles into Israel's promises prior to AD 70. Yes, there was a first fruit resurrection. There was a first fruit harvest taking place. But it would be at the parousia that salvation would go to all of the nations in its fullest sense. Revelation 21, 25 and following. It is after the parousia. It is after the resurrection. It is after the time of the end that the gates of the city, which is built upon the apostles and the prophets of Israel, the gates of that city are now open and all of the nations can flow into it. You see that? It's beautiful. But this is an affirmation of what we have shared with you over and over in this series. Salvation is of the Jews. Salvation in the gospel had to be preached to the Jew first, then to the Greek. And that is what Peter is affirming. He was writing to the 10 northern tribes who were being now united with their brethren in Judea to form one body, being brought in with the Gentiles, with the pagans, and with the righteous remnant of all 12 tribes, joining with pagans, Gentiles, one new man was being created. The new creation was being created. Boy, it's important to understand this. Okay, very, very hurriedly now, I want you to notice that in both Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, and in Peter, we find the theme of martyr vindication. Now, let me recommend that you go to YouTube and you look up my study on 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I have an entire series there devoted to Paul's threefold reference in 1 Corinthians 15, 29 and following, to the suffering that he was enduring at that time. The suffering that Paul was enduring was him being made conformable to the death of Christ. Philippians chapter 3, 8 and following. It was his participation in the sufferings of Christ. Romans 8, 17. It was him filling up in his flesh what was lacking in the afflictions of Christ. It was him, as an apostle, sent by the Lord Jesus Christ, but being persecuted by Israel and filling up the measure of Israel's sin by persecuting the apostles and prophets of Jesus, Luke 11, 49 and following. And thus, Paul said, I suppose, I reckon, I believe, God has set forth us, the apostles, last of all, as men condemned to die. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 9. So what we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 29 and following, is Paul bringing up the issue of end-time martyrdom and his distinctive role as an apostle of Jesus Christ, distinctively chosen to fill up what was lacking in the afflictions of Christ, to fill up the measure of Israel's sin, to be repetitious here, in persecuting the apostles and prophets, and look at Revelation 18, 20 through 24 on that, and thus bringing about the vindication of the martyrs at the coming of the Lord and the judgment in AD 70. I want you to notice how Jesus said Israel's sin would be filled up in that generation. Matthew 23, 29 and following. I want you to know how Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 to 16, that Israel was filling up the measure of their sin by persecuting the apostles and prophets at that time, and judgment was imminent. I want you to notice that Revelation said Babylon, i.e. the city where the Lord was slain, had a cup full of the blood of the saints and of the martyrs, including the apostles and prophets, and judgment was about to fall. Folks, we absolutely must view Paul's reference, threefold reference in 1 Corinthians 15, 29 and following, in that eschatological context. And what that means is that when Paul and the apostles had suffered their martyrdom, that means that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would take place. Because the resurrection in vindication of the martyrs and the rewarding of the prophets, guess what? Would be at the judgment of the city where the Lord was slain. It would be the time of the dead that they should be judged, and when the prophets would be rewarded. Revelation 11, 15 to 19. That's resurrection. That's vindication of the martyrs. That's the rewarding of the prophets, again, at the resurrection. Well, what does Peter say? Peter said that his audience had to suffer only for a little while, until the parousia of Christ, which was ready to be revealed. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 9 and following, be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary the devil walks about seeking whom he may devour. Folks, that's persecution. That's the image of persecution. But rejoice in that you experience in the sufferings of Christ, and your sufferings are being experienced by your brethren throughout the world. But wait a minute, as I pointed out before, it is not simply that their suffering and the suffering of the brethren throughout the world was being, quote, experienced. No, it is the Greek word epiteleo, which means being filled up. Being filled up. So here's Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 29 and following, alluding to his suffering as an apostle, which was to be filled up in that generation. And we have Peter saying that the suffering of those brethren among the diaspora was filling up the measure of sin. Perfect harmony, perfect correlation. And Jesus said, when that measure of sin on the part of Israel for persecuting the apostles and prophets was filled up, he would come in judgment of Old Covenant Israel in AD 70. And we find Peter saying, guess what? The end of all things has drawn near. Just as Paul said that the end would come at the resurrection. Now, if the end would come at the resurrection, when the measure of sin was filled up, as Jesus said in Matthew chapter 23, and if the end would come at the time of the reception of the immortal, incorruptible inheritance, at the time when the suffering of the saints in the diaspora was filled up, then once again you have absolute perfect harmony, and correlating Matthew 23 with that, we have the absolute necessity that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 in vindication of the martyrdom of Paul and the apostles, filling up the measure of sin, that would be fulfilled in AD 70, Matthew 23. And we likewise have, guess what? When the measure of suffering of Peter's audience was filled up, unless we can divorce it from Matthew 23, guess what? That would happen in AD 70. And finally, hey, have I done real well? Well, this may be one of the shortest videos, one of the shortest classes. I want you to know that Paul affirmed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, brethren, I tell you a mystery, we shall not all sleep. That is an affirmation, a clear-cut affirmation, that generation to whom Paul is writing would not pass away until the resurrection took place. It is only because, I want to say this as kindly as possible, it is only because of a preconceived idea about physical bodies coming out of physical holes in the ground that people say, well, you know, Paul could not really have been saying that generation of the Corinthians and Paul would not pass until the resurrection would take place, because everybody knows the resurrection didn't take place. Folks, that's presuppositional, a priori theology. It does not accept the power of Paul's statement. Somebody says, well, you know, Paul is using what's known as the editorial we. Did you realize that the use of the, quote, royal we or the editorial we is normally used by, and this is found in all grammatical works, is normally used by a person to speak of himself and his contemporaries. Might it at times refer to a broader, timeless group? Well, it's possible. But that would have to be demonstrated, not based upon an a priori presuppositional theology that says, I know the resurrection didn't take place because the graves are still there. No. That's not the case. We must accept the biblical testimony unless context, unless exegesis, not eisegesis, reading into the text. Well, I know it didn't happen because the graves are still there. No, that's not the proper way to do things. It's not proper hermeneutic. We must accept Paul's statement. Brethren, we will not all sleep. That is to say, not all of us are going to die. That might say most of us will. And by the way, Paul did not specifically identify himself. One objection here is often lodged, and it is said, well, after all, Paul died before AD 70, therefore he could not have been affirming that generation would not pass. Folks, that's really, with all due respect, that's quite a silly argument. I want you to notice what Jesus said in Matthew 16, 27 and 28. The Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of the Father, and shall reward every man as his work shall be. Now let me ask you a question. Is the coming of Christ with his angels to reward every man the same as the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15? Is not the time of the resurrection the time of the judgment of all men, the coming with the angels? And everybody says, well, amen, sure it is. Well, notice this. Verily I say unto you. Look, folks, the term, amen lego humin in the Greek, is used some 95 times in the New Testament. Almost invariably, the writer or the speaker, and most of the time it was Jesus, by the way, almost invariably, amen lego humin is stated, it is said to draw attention to what is about to be said that's going to emphasize what's already been said. Now, some people claim, oh, we've got an exception in John chapter 3. I'm not going to go into it. But the point of fact is, it's not truly an exception at all. And by the way, even if you can find an exception to a broad general rule, does an exception eliminate the rule? You see how silly this argument is? So what this means is, amen lego humin, Jesus is calling attention to what he's about to say. That's going to call attention to what he just said. Well, what he just said was, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall judge every man. And verily I say unto you, that's like saying, now pay attention. I'm going to say something to emphasize that. There are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, according to Mark chapter 8 and 9, there was a great multitude present that day. And yet Jesus said there are some, not most, some standing here, which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, look, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we have the coming of the Lord for the judgment. for the resurrection, and oh, by the way, for the kingdom. That's Matthew 16, 27, 28. And Jesus said, some standing here will not pass away, taste of death, until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Paul said, brethren, we will not all sleep until the kingdom. Perfect correlation. And now notice, since 1 Corinthians chapter 15, as we have demonstrated, is perfectly parallel with 1 Peter, what does Peter have to say? Christ was, quote, ready to judge the living and the dead, unquote. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5. Let me ask you a question. Is the time of the judgment of the living and the dead the time of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15? I don't know anyone that denies that. Of course it is. Christ was ready. Greek word hitoimos. We'll have more to say about that in the next video. Peter said, and remember, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, then comes the end. And Peter said, the end of all things has drawn near. Egikan, perfect tense. That which was once not near has now drawn near. That means that we cannot argue, oh, well, you know, one day is with the Lord 1,000 years. Time doesn't mean anything with God. Well, it's the Father who knew the day and the hour, who is inspiring Peter to say, what was once not far or not near is now drawn near. And finally, he says, the time, literally the appointed time, for the judgment has come. How much clearer could it be? How much clearer could it be? Paul and Peter are both talking about the eternal inheritance. They are both talking about God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people. They are both talking about the imminent fulfillment of those Old Testament promises. So let me close this presentation with a reiteration at the risk of redundancy. The promise of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, the promise of the eternal inheritance, i.e. the resurrection of 1 Peter, was an old covenant promise made to old covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people. Both the amillennialists and the postmillennialists tell us old covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people ceased to exist in the first century. So once again, if old covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people ceased to exist in the first century, let me reiterate, then either God's promise of the resurrection, which belonged to Israel after the flesh as a covenant people, if it did not happen in the first century when they ceased to exist as a people of the flesh, as a covenant people, then God's promise failed. But let me say again, Paul said that's not possible. So if old covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people ceased to exist in AD 70, then that means that God's promise of the resurrection of the eternal inheritance that is incorruptible, undefilable, which could not fade away, which they were already in the process of receiving, in other words, God's promises were being fulfilled to Israel after the flesh as a covenant people. See, they hadn't passed away yet. Then that means that when Peter said, the end of all things has drawn near, when Peter said Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead, when Peter said the appointed time for the judgment has arrived, he was saying unequivocally, undeniably, and irrefutably that the time of the resurrection, in fulfillment of God's old covenant promises, made to old covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people, stood on the very cusp of fulfillment. And this absolutely, completely, and utterly destroys all futurist eschatologies, which tell us on the one hand, God was through with Israel in the first century, or which completely rip God's promises to Israel out of their historical context, and who deny the reality that Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as a covenant people ceased to exist in AD 70. I suggest to you that these perfect parallels between 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Peter prove beyond a shadow of a doubt the full preterist paradigm and fully establishes covenant eschatology as the truth of biblical eschatology. We will drive that home in our next and in our final installment of our thematic study of 1 Peter when we study the imminence of the end in 1 Peter. We'll see you in that installment.